Hey guys, before we start, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment if you have any feedback. Let's go to the story. People always say, be careful who you let into your life. I wish my dad had listened. Because of the woman he married? She wasn't in it for love. She was in it for what she thought she could take. And now that my dad is gone, she's about to find out she never had a claim to anything. Let's rewind. 7 years ago, my dad was in the worst place of his life. After 30 years of marriage, my mom passed away. And it wrecked him. Not just emotionally, but financially, too. He lost his job, got evicted from their apartment, had nowhere to go, and I was the only person he had left. I wasn't some rich millionaire. I wasn't even making crazy money, but I was stable, and I couldn't let my dad live out of his car. So I did the only thing I could. I bought him a house. It wasn't fancy, just a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, enough for him to have a fresh start. And for a while, things were good. Dad was healing, getting back on his feet. He had his dog, Charlie, a little terrier mix my mom had adored. And that dog? That dog was his lifeline. A living piece of my mom that kept him from completely falling apart. I visited every weekend. We grilled burgers in the backyard. I've been caught up on life. And for the first time in a long time, Dad seemed okay. Then, Sandy showed up. And everything changed. At first, I had no problem with her. Dad met her through mutual friends. They hit it off. She was polite, always smiling, always sweet. So when they got married, I didn't object. If it made my dad happy, who was I to judge? But then, she moved in. And suddenly, things started feeling off. First, it was her stuff everywhere. Dad's house, his space, slowly started looking less like his and more like hers. Then, out of nowhere, her daughter Tina moved in. Tina wasn't some struggling teenager. She was in her late 20s. And she wasn't just crashing for a weekend. She was moving in for good. I didn't say anything. Not yet. But then, a few months later, Beth, Sandy's younger daughter, moved in, too. Now, it wasn't just Dad and Sandy. It was Sandy, 2 grown daughters, and my father, living in a house that I paid for. And somehow, he was the least important person there. At first, I tried to let it go. Maybe Dad liked the company. Maybe he was happy having a full house again. But then, I started noticing how they treated him, how his opinions didn't seem to matter anymore, how everything revolved around what Sandy and her daughters wanted. And the worst part? It was only going to get worse. Because soon, they weren't just taking over the house. They were about to kick out the one thing my dad still loved. And that was my breaking point. It didn't take long before Sandy and her daughters made it clear that Dad's opinion didn't matter. He had once been the kind of man who spoke his mind. Now, he barely had a voice in his own home. Sandy made the rules. Her daughters did whatever they wanted. And Dad? He just went along with it. At first, I thought maybe he was just being easygoing, trying to keep the peace. But the more I visited, the more I noticed how small he seemed in his own house. The biggest shock came when I noticed Charlie was missing. Charlie, the dog he had raised with my mom. The dog that had been his lifeline after she passed. I walked in one afternoon, expecting to see Charlie waiting by the door like always. Instead, silence. I found my dad sitting at the kitchen table, looking drained. "Where's Charlie?" I asked, already feeling a sense of unease. Dad rubbed his temples. Sandy said the house was getting too crowded. She found him a new home. His voice was hollow, like he had been talked into something he didn't want. I felt my stomach twist. Charlie wasn't just a pet. He was family. He was all Dad had left of Mom. And now? He was gone. Sandy waltzed in, acting like she had done Dad a huge favor. "It was for the best," she said with a smile. "Charlie needed space to run around, and we just don't have that here anymore." She didn't even try to hide it. She was calling the shots now. And Dad? He didn't argue. He just sat there, defeated. I clenched my fists, but I knew it wasn't the time to start a fight. Dad looked tired, and I didn't want to make things worse. But I knew one thing: this wasn't his house anymore. It was Sandy's. And she was taking whatever she wanted. After that, I started visiting less often. Not because I didn't care. But every time I stepped into that house, it felt less like my father's home. The furniture was replaced. Old photos of my mom? Gone. The backyard, once Dad's favorite place to sit and read, had been transformed into Tina's meditation space. Dad wasn't even allowed to watch what he wanted on TV anymore. It was always Sandy's reality shows, Beth's YouTube channels, or whatever nonsense Tina was into that week. Everything about that house felt wrong. And it wasn't long before Dad's health started slipping. He lost weight. Stopped keeping up with his doctor's appointments. Sandy took over his medications. She claimed she was helping, but I knew better. She was controlling every aspect of his life. And Dad? He let her go. Or maybe he just didn't have the energy to fight anymore. I knew I had to do something. But before I could act, everything took a turn for the worse. My father's decline happened faster than I could have imagined. Every time I saw him, he looked smaller, weaker, and more exhausted. His once lively personality had faded into silence. He rarely laughed, barely spoke, and seemed like a guest in his own home. It was clear Sandy had total control over him. But I refused to sit back and watch. I started visiting more often, even when I wasn't welcome. I kept a close eye on him, asked about his medication, and made sure he was eating. But no matter what I did, Sandy always found a way to push me out. She controlled everything. Doctor's appointments? She handled them. Medication? She took charge of that, too. Finances? She was suddenly the one managing Dad's money. If I asked too many questions, she acted like I was causing problems. She always had an answer, always dismissed my concerns like I was being paranoid. Dad never stood up to her. And I knew why. He was too tired to fight. But I wasn't. And I wasn't going to let her take everything from him. One day, I stopped by unannounced. The house was eerily quiet. Sandy and her daughters were nowhere to be found. I walked in and found Dad sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. Dad, what's going on? He sighed, rubbing his temples. She wants me to sign some papers, he muttered. My heart pounded. What kind of papers? He hesitated. Then, after a moment, he pushed a stack of documents toward me. I flipped through them, my stomach twisting with every page. It was a transfer of ownership. Sandy wanted him to sign the house over to her. The house I bought. I felt my blood boil. Did you read any of this? Dad shook his head. She said it's just for protection. In case something happens to me. I gritted my teeth. Dad, this isn't protection. She's trying to take everything from you. He didn't argue. Didn't even look surprised. He just looked tired. Like he already knew, but didn't have the strength to fight anymore. I shoved the papers into my bag. You're not signing these. For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of relief in his eyes. He nodded weakly. I wasn't going to. But I knew Sandy wouldn't stop. She had a plan. And I needed to be one step ahead of her. I left the house that day with one goal in mind. To make sure Sandy never got her hands on what wasn't hers. Because if she thought she could manipulate my father into handing over everything he had left. She had no idea who she was messing with. After leaving with the documents, I knew I had to act fast. Sandy wasn't just pushing my father to sign over his house, she was trying to erase him. She had already taken control of his life. Now she wanted the last thing he had left. And I wasn't going to let that happen. The first thing I did was visit a lawyer. I explained everything, how I had bought the house, how my father lived there, and how Sandy was trying to manipulate him into signing it away. The lawyer listened carefully, then leaned back in his chair. She has no legal right to the house, he said. Your name is on the deed, not your father's. Even if he signed those papers, it wouldn't mean anything. Relief washed over me. She couldn't take the house. But that didn't mean she wouldn't try something else. And I needed to be ready. I started digging deeper into Sandy's history. If she was this ruthless with my father, I had a feeling this wasn't her first time pulling something like this. And I was right. She had 2 previous marriages. Both ended with her walking away with a significant amount of money. One ex-husband lost his house. The other? His retirement savings were completely drained. She knew exactly what she was doing. And she had picked my father as her next target. Armed with this information, I went back to the house. Sandy was in the living room, sipping coffee like she hadn't just tried to scam my father out of his home. We need to talk, I said. She barely looked up. About what? I pulled out the documents and dropped them on the table. This. Her expression didn't even change. She just sighed. You don't understand. This is for your father's protection. I stared at her, disgusted. You mean your protection? Her fake patience disappeared. You have no right to interfere, she snapped. This is between me and my husband. I let out a cold laugh. That's funny because the house? It's mine, asterisk. For the first time, her confidence cracked. What? I leaned forward. My name is on the deed. My father never owned this house. So, even if he signed those papers, you'd still own nothing. For a moment, she just stared at me, like she couldn't process what I had just said. Then her face twisted in anger. You ungrateful little brat. After everything I've done for this family, this is how you treat me. I didn't even blink. You don't get to play the victim. You used my father. You tried to steal from him. And now that your little plan is ruined, you're throwing a tantrum. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You'll regret this. I shook my head. No, Sandy. You will. Then I turned and walked away. But I knew this wasn't over yet. Sandy wasn't going to just walk away. She was going to fight back. And I had to be ready for whatever she tried next. I knew Sandy wouldn't take the loss quietly. She had spent years manipulating my father, twisting him into someone who barely recognized himself. She wasn't just going to pack up and leave. And I was right. Because of the next thing she did, she tried to take everything. A few days after our confrontation, my father called me. His voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. She's been going through my accounts. I gripped my phone tighter. What do you mean? My bank accounts. My pension. She's asking questions. Wants access. The rage that had been simmering inside me boiled over. She had lost her chance at taking the house. Now she was going after his money. I dropped everything and drove over. The second I walked inside, I knew Sandy had been expecting me. She was sitting at the kitchen table, acting like she had done nothing wrong. You again, she said flatly, not even bothering to hide her irritation. I didn't waste time. Stay away from my father's accounts. She scoffed. Oh, please. Do you think I'd steal from my own husband? I pulled out the paperwork I had brought with me. Because while she had been planning her next move, so had I. Before coming over, I met with my father's bank. With his permission, I locked his accounts down. His pension? Transferred into a private account only he could access. His savings? Protected with an alert system to track any unauthorized activity. And to top it off, I had already called an attorney to discuss filing a restraining order if she kept pushing. I set the paperwork down in front of her. Try to touch his money, and you'll be dealing with legal consequences. Her fake smile disappeared. For the first time, I saw real panic in her eyes. You little. She cut herself off, clenching her jaw. You think you can just come in here and take control? I held her gaze. I'm not taking control. I'm stopping you from doing it. She turned to my father, desperation creeping into her voice. Are you really going to let him do this to me? For a moment, my father hesitated. Sandy had spent so long breaking him down, making him think she was the only person he could rely on. I could see the doubt flicker in his eyes. But then, he looked at me, looked at the paperwork, and I saw something shift. For the first time in a long time, he stood up for himself. I'm not signing anything over to you, Sandy. Her mouth fell open. She had lost, and she knew it. Without another word, she stormed out of the room. I exhaled, finally letting go of the tension that had been gripping me. My father looked down at the table, his hands shaking. I should have seen it sooner, he murmured. I didn't say anything, because deep down, he already knew the truth. He had been used, manipulated, and now, it was finally over. Or at least, I hoped it was. Because Sandy wasn't just going to walk away quietly. She had one last trick up her sleeve. And this time, she was coming for more than just money. She wanted revenge. I should have known Sandy wouldn't leave quietly. She had spent years controlling my father, sinking her claws into his life. Now that I had stripped her of her power, she wasn't just angry. She wanted revenge. At first, it was small things. She spread rumors through family and neighbors, painting me as some greedy son who had turned my father against her. She even had a few relatives fooled. A couple of aunts sent me messages, saying I should be ashamed of myself for breaking up Dad's marriage. I didn't bother responding. People who believed her version of events weren't people I needed in my life. But then, she escalated. And this time, she went too far. A few weeks after I had locked down my father's accounts, he called me, sounding shaken. She's trying to evict me. I nearly dropped my phone. What? She says she talked to a lawyer. That since we're married, she has rights to the house, and she's filing for ownership. She was desperate. And now, she was grasping at anything to try and take back control. But there was just one problem. She had no legal claim. I met with my lawyer the next day, explained everything, the threats, the eviction attempt, the financial manipulation. He reviewed the documents and let out a short, amused breath. She has nothing. The house is yours. You bought it. You own it. Her marriage to your father gives her no claim. She can try, but any judge would throw it out. I nodded, but my anger still burned. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about principle. She wasn't just trying to take property. She was trying to erase my father's independence, to push him out of his own home. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I called my father and told him exactly what the lawyer said. that she had no case. No matter what she did, she couldn't touch the house. I expected him to sound relieved, but instead, there was silence. Then, in a low voice, he said something that made my chest tighten. I don't care about the house, son. I just want her gone. I felt something inside me shift. For the first time, he had finally admitted it. He didn't love Sandy. Didn't want to fight for the marriage. Didn't want to stay. He just wanted out. And I was going to help him. The next day, I showed up at the house. Sandy was there, sitting in the living room like she owned the place. She barely looked up. Here to lecture me again? She asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. I didn't take the bait. Dad wants a divorce. That got her attention. Her head snapped up, eyes widening. Excuse me. You heard me, I said. Pack your things. He's filing, and you're leaving. Her face twisted in anger. You can't just throw me out. Actually, I said, pulling out the legal notice I had drafted with my lawyer, we can. I handed it to her. A formal eviction notice. Legally binding. She had 30 days to leave, and there was nothing she could do about it. For a moment, she just stared at the paper. Then she did what she always did. She tried to play the victim. I gave up everything for your father, she cried. I took care of him. I was the best thing that ever happened to him. I didn't flinch. You took care of yourself, Sandy. And now? You can do that somewhere else. She glared at me. For years, she had manipulated my father, pushed him around, convinced that he needed her. But now, her power was gone, and she knew it. She stormed upstairs, slamming doors and throwing things into a suitcase. I didn't watch her go. Didn't say another word. Because for the first time since she came into our lives, she didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was that my father was finally free, and I was going to make sure he never had to deal with someone like her again. Sandy didn't go quietly. She stomped around the house, slamming doors, muttering curses under her breath, throwing things into her suitcase like she wanted to make a scene. But I didn't react. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a fight. Neither did my father. He sat in his chair, hands folded, watching her like a man who had finally woken up from a nightmare. There was no begging, no second-guessing, just relief. And when Sandy finally walked out the door for the last time, I saw his shoulders relax for the first time in years. She was gone, and she was never coming back. For a while, I worried she would try to retaliate. I dragged my father through a messy divorce, make up some ridiculous claim about money or assets. But she had nothing to stand on. The house was mine. The finances were locked down. She walked away with nothing, just like she deserved. My father started coming back to life. At first, he didn't know what to do with himself. He had spent so long being controlled by Sandy that he had forgotten how to live on his own. But I helped him. I encouraged him to go back to the things he used to love. He started spending time in the backyard again, tending to the little vegetable garden he had neglected for years. He went out with friends, something he hadn't done in ages. He even got a new dog, a little rescue pup named Benny. And Benny? He never left Dad's side. It was like Charlie had sent a new friend to keep him company. One evening, we sat outside, watching the sunset from his porch. He turned to me, eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time, peace. I should have listened to you sooner, he said. I shook my head. It doesn't matter now. You're free, and that's what counts. He smiled. For the first time in years, I saw a real, genuine smile. Thank you, son. And at that moment, I knew. It was all worth it. Sandy tried to ruin my father's life. She thought she could take everything. But in the end, she walked away with nothing. And we had everything we needed. Because family isn't about who takes the most. It's about who stands by you when you have nothing left. And that's something she would never understand. But we did. And that's why we won.